It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to the fifth in our speaker series, and especially to welcome Fernanda to give a talk today. Fernanda Jahn Verri, soon to be a doctor. I don't know if I can technically call you a doctor yet, or until next week when you get your hood.
Starting on Friday.
On Friday, right? Almost a doctor. So yeah, it's in our department here at UCLA, so it's really exciting that you're here to present your dissertation research through this speaker series. Fernanda, for those of you who don't know, has a master's in urban and regional planning from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. Yeah. And as you'll see in her talk, her research centers on housing precarity, displacement, financialization of the city, poor people's movements, informality, and post-colonial theory. And I'm very excited to see this talk, even though I've read the dissertation, and I'm glad to see Anastasia, one of her dissertation chair here with us. And so we'll have a nice discussion afterwards. But I will now pass the floor to you, Fernanda, to tell us about your research.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me, Pavel. So yeah, so I will be graduating on Fridays. I did my PhD here at UCLA in urban planning. And today I'm going to be presenting about a chapter of my dissertation. So my doctoral research focuses on housing and land dispossession in Brazil, more specifically on court order removals within both informal and formal housing sectors in Brazil. But again, before going forward, I wanted to thank Pavel for inviting me, and also Pavel and for the other members of my dissertation, including Professor Anastasia here, for all their support and help throughout these last years. And I also wanted to just give like a brief shout out to networks like this, right? To for example, to Ciudad, UCLA, to the because I think that UCLA Ciudades, right, and all the projects that Professor Pavel leads as part of the Latin American Cities Initiative here at UCLA are very important because they challenge, right, this false dichotomy between cities in the global south and cities in the global north. So I think the work being done by Pavel and the initiative as a whole is really relevant in the sense that it basically shows to US scholars, policymakers, and urban planners how Latin American cities might also represent cases that deserve close attention, right? That deserve to be studied, and that could be that drawn inspiration from. So my talk is organized in this way. So I'll be covering the topic, the conceptual framework that I've used, some really brief literature review, my objectives, the research question and hypothesis, the background and context, the case of Porto Alegre, the relevance of my study, the case for court order evictions, my methodology, findings, and finally the conclusion. So my goal, as I was saying, broadly speaking, was to basically understand, right, how urban displacement was taking place today in Brazil, despite the country's constitutional recognition of the right to the city and the country's internationally acclaimed land legislation that I will briefly talk about in a moment. So I basically did this conjectural analysis of contemporary eviction apparatuses, right, which I mean the complex set of actors and drivers mobilized by these eviction practices. And I did this analysis focusing, as I mentioned, on the case of Brazil and centering my study around the judiciary. In particular, my contribution with my dissertation was basically to examine, right, the structuring logics of displacement practices starting in 2001, starting when the city statute was published in Brazil. And to put it bluntly, Brazil, again, is internationally known for having a very progressive land legislation and inclusive policies, right? So my interest in this topic began because I wanted to understand, to unpack what it seems to be like two very like paradoxical questions. So the first one, why is Brazil, a country with one of the most progressive and inclusive land policies in the world, being accused of violating the constitutional right to housing of thousands of citizens? And also, why is the Brazilian judiciary ordering and executing forced evictions of thousands of marginalized families? So these were some of the puzzles that I was interested in exploring in my dissertation. And basically, I argued that these removals and violations, right, must be understood as part of what I call legalized displacement, which is basically this land dispossession practices that are not only a direct outcome of real estate speculation and housing commodification, but of a much broader discriminating process in which the courts, right, are playing a major role. So under this conceptual framework or site, right, that I call judicial dispossession, I was mostly interested in understanding how the courts were applying paradigmatic and innovative land use and housing legislations in their rulings. And in particular, what was the judicial discourse when the courts decided for and also against eviction? So in other words, I wanted to understand this sort of like the so-called gap, right, between tax law and how this law was being applied in Brazil, again, when it comes to housing, land, and property rights. So in this sense, before focusing on the chapter that I'm going to present today, I wanted to add that my work, right, on judicial displacement or dispossession represents both a conceptual, so judicial dispossession in this case represents both a conceptual and methodological arrangement, right, for my study. Hence, I'm not only using the judiciary, I'm not only using the courts as the site of my investigation, but I'm also looking at evictions and displacement through these legal lenses. That being said, let me open a parenthesis, right, and argue and claiming here that I'm basically contributing to this scholarship, right, on the encounters of urban planning and the law. Basically, like, although I won't have time to situate my work entirely within the literature, I must say that there are some many important works, right, being published, both in Brazil and abroad, that have been trying to unpack this judicialization, as we call, of land struggles, of housing and property rights in various contexts and frameworks. So these authors being Gotham Baum, right, Asher Gardner, Nick Blumley, Iftacho, James Halston, Giovanna Milano, Adriana Lima, Edazio Fernandes, Betania Alfonsín, and many, many others. So basically what I wanted to argue here in regards to literature is that within this emerging body of legal geography that suggests that marginalizing powers are being employed through policy and legal frameworks, for example, scholars like Gardner, for example, argued that the judiciary currently represents the greatest threat of eviction in the global South. He also claims that post-millennial evictions in India, for example, are now being perceived as acts of governance rather than a violation. Moreover, Nicholas Blumley explains how political ideologies are overruling alternative property regimes in favor of tenure models often associated with private and individual forms of land ownership. And finally, Oren Iftacho suggests that displacement is becoming an efficient tool used by the state, right, used by the government as a foundation of contemporary citizenship, urban citizenship. So the greater the threat of displacement, something that he calls displaceability, the weaker the civil prerogatives, right, urban citizenship is. So basically, I'm contributing again to this field of research, not only by adding to theories of property, but also by studying, right, how contemporary frameworks of land use and property rights have been mobilized for and also against land dispossession in Brazil. But before unpacking, right, the discourses against displacement and for that I will discuss later, it's important for us to understand how these eviction apparatuses, right, look like in Brazil. And this is precisely what I'm going to do today. So I actually, my first empirical chapter focuses on this broad overview of eviction apparatuses in Brazil. And my later, the chapter 2 and 3, the empirical chapters 2 and 3 of my dissertation, they go more in depth in qualitative terms, trying to analyze, right, trying to conduct this discourse analysis to understand the political ideologies behind the judges' reasons why, when ruling for and against evictions, okay? So how are these evictions pursued by the Brazilian judiciary today? So the first empirical chapter, as I was saying, of my dissertation, aims to document, basically, aims to analyze who is getting evicted by the Brazilian judiciary, from where, as well as under what terms. So in addition to clarifying some of the keywords being mobilized by the judges when ordering and contesting these evictions, I also elucidate the most cited legislations in the ruling. So in this chapter, therefore, I study, right, I focus on the role of the judiciary when it comes to land dispossession by looking at eviction litigations filed in TJRS, which is the state court for the city of Porto Alegre. And I look at the years between 2001 and 2018, and I'll explain why later. But basically, I chose to analyze evictions field within this temporal framing for two reasons. First, because seminal scholars have already analyzed, have already studied in length the previous eviction apparatuses in Brazil, including the forced evictions against informal tenants, right, led mainly by the government in the 1980s and 1990s. And I'm talking about Perman, right? I'm talking about Valadares. But the second reason is that I'm interested in exploring if and how the judiciary is mobilizing important legislations established in the last 2 decades, including the paradigmatic 2001 city statute, which was supposed to expand and democratize, right, access to land and housing in the country. Therefore, as I mentioned before, I'm doing this conjectural analysis, right, of the contemporary eviction apparatus in Brazil and centering my study around the judiciary. Let me see. I think having this overview of the eviction apparatuses, which is basically what I will be doing here today, help us to achieve, right, these objectives, right? Meaning that my goal in this dissertation was not so much to debate the laws and their particularities, but to discuss the context in which their enforcement is inserted, including the circumstances, right, in which these legal codes and legal logics are applied or, of course, ignored. And although I'm not interested in the legal frameworks that are enabling, although I'm also interested in the legal frameworks that are enabling process such as the commodification of housing, my main objective here is to understand how the judiciary interprets, right, and applies the law when it comes to eviction, especially in regards to the factors, right, that influence their decisions and that determine their verdicts, right? So in sum, I can say that my main concern was always to pursue the role of the Brazilian courts in producing or contesting displacement, and to explore how this legal apparatus might be used to advance housing justice. With all of that being said, and again, focusing on my first empirical chapter, I wanted to clarify that this is a part of my dissertation specifically grounded on the inventory of eviction court records I built with over 3,000 documents. So I will give you this broader view of how the judicial dispossession looks like in Brazil, including the main drivers and actors involved in these litigations. And basically based on quantitative and spatial data, besides understanding the magnitude, right, of court order evictions in Porto Alegre, I will also discuss the most prevalent reasons for evictions across my inventory and within specific groups of plaintiffs and defendants, the overall profile, right, of them, and the laws, as I mentioned, and keywords that the judges are mobilizing in their decisions, both while ordering for and against evictions. And finally, I also investigate the incidence of evictions across different socioeconomic and demographic groups. So by geocoding the addresses of these contested properties, right, of the properties being contested in these litigations, and by overlapping this with census tract information, social demographic information, I was able to generate some GIS maps to learn these spatial patterns, right, to learn which residents were at a greater risk of evictions based on their locations and so on. So these were the 3 questions that I had in my dissertation, but as I mentioned today, I'll be focusing on the first question: how are evictions pursued by the Brazilian judiciary today, and how they are being contested? And in regards to this first question, I basically, sorry, there's a typo there, but I basically claim, right, I hypothesize that some of the drivers of contemporary evictions in Brazil are directly related to the commodification of housing, recent legislation on land use, and political ideologies that privilege some regimes of property right over others. So the current eviction apparatuses, in Brazil are produced by these like very different processes involving the market and the state, in which the judiciary plays a major role, not only by mediating these conflicts, but also by often ignoring or misusing key and innovative legislations, right? So I also argue actually that besides displacement targeting informal tenants, there's also a growing movement of tenancy and mortgage-related eviction cases in Brazil. My study draws from Porto Alegre, right, a city with participatory planning tradition. And before I tell you a little bit more about Porto Alegre, I'm gonna give you a very overview of access to land in Brazil, right? So Brazil, as I said earlier, has one of the most progressive legislation when it comes to access to land. The last 1988 federal constitution made housing a right. The 2001 city statute create and advance other inclusionary legal mechanisms, such as a diverse possession law, by creating the means through which communities could claim ownership of private vacant land collectively, so collective adverse possession law. Also, this 2001 legislation implemented the direito de uso, which is basically similar to adverse possession law, but also applies to public properties as well, enabling, therefore, people to claim not the right to possess, to own, but the right to occupy, to possess vacant public properties as well. So in sum, the state in Brazil, I wanted to say that always has, like as in many other Latin American cities, has like had a fundamental part in both protecting and impairing the access, right, to adequate housing, especially of the urban poor. So in this sense, this 1988 federal constitution and the 2001 city statute were very paradigmatic, right? Because these laws open a new chapter in the Brazilian history of property rights, creating this innovative urban legal framework to democratize access to adequate housing in the country and correct centuries of non-egalitarian and discriminatory land practices. And one of the most important like legal concept, right, that was actually ratified by the 2001 city statute was this thing called social function of property, right? So the statute actually claims that all urban properties must fulfill a social function, right? And by this, it means that fulfilling a social function essentially means that when a parcel or a building is abandoned for long periods of time, or the owners are speculating on it, the state is theoretically legally entitled to take measures to ensure the actual use of these properties, subjecting the property to the social function, right? So here is highlighted, right? I brought the passage of the law. So actually before expropriating the parcel, there are other procedures that could be implemented in order to mandate that the property owner kind of fulfill this social function, including, for example, something called progressive real estate taxation, although actually there are only few municipalities in Brazil that apply such mechanism. And Porto Alegre actually does not have IPTU progressivo, which is basically stands for this progressive real estate taxation. So the specificity of Porto Alegre, Porto Alegre is the capital of Rio Grande do Sul state, and has a history of progressive housing policies and participatory planning programs. The city was the first capital in the world to apply the orçamento participativo, which stands for participatory budgeting, right? It was implemented by PT, or the Workers' Party, in its first year of office in 1989. So through these programs, citizens would be able to participate in the decision-making process regarding the allocation of municipal resources and investment. And this program also boosted popular articulation among the urban poor around themes such as urban infrastructure, housing, and informal tenancy. the Workers' Party had an elected mayor in Porto Alegre from 1989 to 2004, the longest term the Workers' Party held at the Brazilian capital until today. And the socialist administration also helped to establish several housing cooperatives in the city. Porto Alegre was also one of the first cities in Brazil to execute the direito de uso, which is, again, a diverse possession law, but applied to public properties. It was approved in 1990. And finally, Porto Alegre is also known for hosting several editions of the World Social Forum, this worldwide global justice movement, including the first edition in 2001. So Porto Alegre, in this sense, is a very useful test case, we can argue, because if the shift that I'm expecting to witness, right, is legalized displacement apparatus is happening in Brazil, Porto Alegre perhaps is the place that we would be least expecting it to occur. And before I finally go to my methodology, let me just share with you two things. So the first, what is at stake here? So basically, Brazil represents this very paradigmatic case, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, when it comes to land use and property rights. Also, evictions within the formal housing market are understudied actually in Brazil. Like most scholars focus on displacement within the informal housing market, so among informal tenants. And finally, displacement and dispossession not only imply, right, the loss of housing and land, but also of personhood, right? And the second thing that I wanted to mention, so this was actually part of my relevance, but that I'm basically challenging seminal works on displacement by calling into question this false dichotomy between eviction in the global north and eviction in the global south, that authors like David Harvey claim, right? But basically, the second thing that I wanted to comment here is that why I'm studying court order evictions. So court order evictions, of course, are only one category of eviction. They do not fully account for the real scale of displacement in Brazil. Even within the formal housing market, many tenants might be arrested to leave before even facing an eviction lawsuits. They do not exhaust the lived experiences, right, of people being displaced. So, for example, extra legal evictions might be even more violent, as they do not follow any institutionalized mandate, right? However, I think court order evictions also must be critically investigated and studied, especially in Brazil, because as I mentioned, Brazil is a country where the right to housing is encoded, right, in its constitution. So displacement produced under the rule of law becomes even more problematic, right, in my view. So evictions in this case are being performed by the ultimate institution supposed to protect people's social and civil prerogatives, including their access to adequate housing. So when the judiciary orders the eviction of poor tenants, for example, the courts are not only denying the citizens their constitutional right to housing, right, but they are denying their urban citizenship itself. Okay, so after this huge intro, let's talk about my methodology and findings. So to understand the eviction apparatuses in Porto Alegre, right, and the forces and drivers behind such arrangements, I'm using two different methods. So I rely basically on archival research to raise the data that I'm analyzing. So basically I'm assessing legalized displacement through this inventory of all eviction notices issued in Porto Alegre by the Rio Grande do Sul Court of Justice, which is the State Court of Appeals, filed between 2001, since the publication of the city statute, until 2018. I accessed these evictions records through the Rio Grande do Sul Court of Justice online database, resulting in approximately 3,000 eviction court records. However, to access which cases resulted in evictions order and extract the relevant data that I was looking for, I had to systematize the documents downloaded from the online database, and build this table with more than 6,000 records. So basically, only approximately 3,000 records qualify, and I'm going to explain why later. But I had to erase almost 7,000 eviction court records. And Additionally, I also conducted a spatial analysis to understand the geographic context, including where these evictions were concentrated, and the social and demographic and economic profile of the residents living in those areas. So because I could not find the addresses of the properties being contested in these litigations, right? I had to actually access the hard copies of many of these documents. So again, I not only looked at the online databases, but my research team, so I hired 8 research assistants, and myself had to go to the actual like physical archives in Porto Alegre. So after finding these addresses of approximately 1,000 properties, I geocoded them and added census tract, socioeconomic and demographic information to produce these maps that I'm going to show you today, illustrating the spatial distribution of evictions in the city. So as I mentioned before, I raised more than 7,000 eviction court records. In addition to allowing you to filter the eviction court records by date, these online database, right, by the state court also allows you to filter them by keywords or by place. So I apply some of the desired filters that I can explain later, like which keywords did I use, etc. But this search ended up resulting in 7,469 eviction court records. Then I listed, these were all of the variables that I extracted from each of these eviction court records: trial date, number of eviction court record, type of procedure, the objective of the litigation, plaintiffs and defendants' names, as well as their lawyers' information, the reasons, right, why the plaintiff was filing this lawsuit, who was the judge, the final verdict, the keywords, the laws mobilized, etc. So after building this database, right, with almost 8,000 eviction court records, I disregarded the records considered incomplete, right, where some of these variables that I previously mentioned were missing. I did the same with litigations whose objective was neither the maintenance of possession or ownership, nor the repossession of these residential urban properties. Again, I can talk more about this process later, but it ended up resulting in 3,191 eviction court records, right? So these were the records that qualify for my analysis. And over the 1,000 addresses that I were able to collect from going online and accessing these documents, and also going to the physical archives, only 631 addresses were linked to these qualifying eviction court records that I've raised. Okay, so I'm not going to explain how the Brazilian judiciary works. I've written in length about this in my dissertation if you're interested. But basically, as I mentioned earlier, Porto Alegre is one of the largest cities in Brazil, right? The city is located in the Lake Guaíba waterway and is divided into 81 official neighborhoods. And in terms of population density, Porto Alegre follows the same pattern encountered in other major Brazilian cities and has this denser central area compared to its periphery. And the neighborhoods located in the geographical center of Porto Alegre also have like a higher white population, a smaller average household size, and greater average monthly income, as these figures demonstrate. And although most residents of Porto Alegre's neighborhood own their own housing, as figure 10 indicates, these centrally located areas, also wealthier and wider, tend to have a higher percentage of renter-occupied housing units when contrasted to peripheral neighborhoods. And furthermore, the average of square meter price for sale and for rent is greater in these central locations. Also, right, as illustrated throughout figures 5 to 14, most properties whose ownership or possession was being contested in eviction lawsuits, right, are also located in these central neighborhoods. So you can see them represented by these little black triangles right here. And again, the central areas in some tend to have this higher population density, made up mostly of people with higher average monthly income and white residents. And although more densely populated, the centrally located regions where the properties contested, right, in these eviction lawsuits are clustered have a smaller average household size. And additionally, these inner zones, right, they tend to concentrate properties with greater average square meter price, both in terms of sale and lease. And also, even though Porto Alegre has in general this very high rate of owner-occupied housing units, the neighborhoods where the majority of these properties, objects of these litigations are located, right, where they're situated, these areas also have the greatest renter-occupied housing units rates in the city. And specifically, as the figures that I've shown you suggest, tenants may be at the epicenter, right, of judicial dispossession in Porto Alegre. And even after I normalize data, right, by looking at figures 15 and 16, we can see that the rate of contested property per household unit and per resident, we can observe that there's still a prevalence, right, of evictions in these denser and inner neighborhoods, right, more affluent neighborhoods. And next, I was also interested in assessing the spatial patterns of court order displacement in Porto Alegre in terms of the keywords mobilized and breaking out to other categories. So let me begin showing you this. So first, I filtered the lawsuits analyzed here by subject, and we can see that most litigations involving renter properties, symbolized by the green dots, are indeed located in the centrally located neighborhoods, and lawsuits involving other possession issues such as long conflicts, squatting, etc., represented in pink, and also the lawsuits involving the sale of these housing units represented in yellow are more spread out through Porto Alegre. On the other hand, this figure 18, right, demonstrate that over 2/3 of the analyzed lawsuits aim to maintain possession in green here. And they also appear to be more spatially scattered, right, than those lawsuits aiming repossession, represented by the pink color, which tends to be concentrated in central neighborhoods. And figure 19 shows that, on the other hand, right, when it comes to the decisions issued by the state court, almost 2/3 of the verdicts order repossession. So most contested properties that I'm analyzing here tend to be situated in this inner city neighborhoods, right? So most of these properties that aims to maintain possession are situated in the inner city neighborhoods. And although the number of cases that I'm analyzing here, right, in figures 20 and 21 represents a little over 10% of the universe of the collected addresses, right, that I had, these maps indicate that the lawsuits involving institutional private actors usually target properties more centrally located. In turn, the litigations encompassing properties situated in marginal areas of the city usually involve the government either as a plaintiff or as a defendant. And in terms of the year that the verdict was issued, the actions deciding on properties located in Porto Alegre's extreme south tend to be older, while those in the north regions are usually filed after 2009, as figure 22 demonstrate. And I think I'm gonna skip my next explanation because I'm gonna talk about the legal marks when it comes to tenancy law while I'm showing you the tables that I've also gathered. But basically, what I wanted to add here is that it's impossible to predict the socioeconomic conditions of the plaintiffs and the defendants, right, involved in these litigations that I'm analyzing. So one way that I kind of overcame this limitation was by looking at the lawsuits involving the public defender's office, right, representing both the plaintiffs and the defendants. So the public defender office was established in 1994 in Porto Alegre and represents low-income citizens. This is basically self-declare. I can later on list, right, the conditions for you to be able to seek assistance from the public defender's office. But basically, this was a way for me to overcome, right, this limitation of not being able to access the actual socioeconomic profile of the parties involved in this litigation. So as figure 23 shows, despite the central neighborhoods being inhabited by more affluent people and concentrated the most expensive housing units, both for sale and lease in Porto Alegre when compared to marginal areas of the city, the Public Defender's Office also represents many residents, right, living in those areas. So the Public Defender's Office assistance and presence in these regions might be related to the fact that the vacant properties in the inner city, be it properties owned by the government or vacant private properties, are currently being occupied by squatter groups. Therefore, we can argue that displacement in Porto Alegre, right in the center of Porto Alegre, does not only affect the wealthy or more affluent residents. And finally, the last part of this spatial analysis focused on identifying these locational patterns, right, of these decisions, mobilizing certain keywords and certain legislations. So these figures 24 and 25 are useful to illustrate a couple of points. So for example, these maps indicate that eviction court records containing the most cited laws in my overall sample, as well as previously defined keywords, are located more in this central area. So as we can observe, eviction court records for properties located in the central neighborhoods also involve adverse possession lawsuits and decisions mobilizing the term right to housing. So this might indicates, as I previously mentioned, that some of the lawsuits contesting the ownership or possession of some of these units concentrated in these inner neighborhoods might involve informal tenants, right? In addition to, of course, with those within the formal housing market. And the keyword social function of property that I've explained about, however, tends to appear only in actions, right, in lawsuits field for properties situated in the peripheral neighborhoods of Porto Alegre. So I think I'm almost out of time. But basically, I wanted to briefly mention here some of the tables and graphs that I put together about the variables that I extracted from the whole data set, right, that I had. So let me skip that, but I look at, for example, the reasons, right, mobilized by the plaintiffs when filing the lawsuit, if it was related to lease or the rental of the property, sale, ownership, possession issues, etc. So this graph here ranks the most cited reasons within each of these subgroups, right? And we can also observe the percentage for each of them. So for those decisions whose matter was the lease of properties, the most common reason given by the plaintiff when filing the eviction lawsuit was a denial of the right to be heard. Another common reason found was the breach of contract, excessive charging, or double charging. When it comes to these litigations whose subject was the sale of properties, the two top reasons by the plaintiffs were breach of contract and buyer in default. And lastly, when it comes to the litigations involving other possession, right, and ownership issues, the most common reasons given by the plaintiffs when entering with these litigations were basically usurpation of possession, right, of the property, issues with demonstration of possession, and issues with the transference of the property. These figures right here show the total of decisions for repossession and for maintenance of possession by year. It also indicates that verdicts deciding for eviction with the blue line here and against it with the red line tend to follow the same slope from the overall number of appellate decisions, right, of decisions that I've studied, represented by the yellow line. However, when we look at figure 30, it becomes evidence that the years comprising, right, higher eviction verdicts are 2001, 2007, 2009, and 2010. And the year of 2008 in turn represents the date with the lowest percentage of repossession verdicts. Then we can argue that in general, right, the state of appeals courts tend to decide for repossession with an overall percentage of 64%. And if we break out the eviction decisions by subject, right, concerning the lease of properties, the sale of properties, or other ownership and possession issues, we see that the percentage is very similar. So 55.41 when involving lease, 55.01 when involving sale, and 55.16 when involving other possession or ownership issues. When looking at the eviction court records filling in the state court, I also look at the types, right, of plaintiffs and defendants involved. So when accessing the litigation involving institutional actors, we see that the judges tend to decide for repossession only when the plaintiff represents public actors. In all of the cases, most verdicts benefit the defendants. And in turn, we can see figure 32 shows, sorry, I forgot to add the right figure here, but basically my research shows that the state court tends to issue eviction decisions benefiting institutional actors when they are the defendant, regardless if they are banks, construction firms, developers, or if they represent the government. And in fact, by exploring closely the cases in which the government is involved, we see that Porto Alegre's housing authority is, when Porto Alegre Housing Authority is the plaintiff, the state judges tend to benefit the housing authority in 83% of their decisions. And I also assessed, right, the eviction court records by looking at the keywords and laws mobilized, right, by the judges in their decisions. And the most cited keyword is actually civil code, right, mobilizing approximately 1/6 of my entire sample, right, in more than 500 decisions. And I discussed the Brazilian civil code in the second empirical chapter of my dissertation, but it essentially regulates private relations between individuals, including their properties. So the right to housing and social functional property terms were not cited nearly as much as civil code. This was already expected, as usually the first two keywords only appear in verdicts deciding actions involving informal tenants. Nonetheless, it's worth mentioning that verdicts containing the term right to housing or social function of property have a high eviction rate, right? Judges decide for eviction. In approximately 75% of them, the judge decided for eviction. So again, I don't have time to elaborate more on the context in which those terms are mobilized. But if you're interested in learning more about this, you can take a look at chapter 2 and 3 of my dissertation. And this is my last graph. So finally, this figure shows that the most cited laws in the state court, right, issued between 2001 2018 in Porto Alegre, are these 8 legislations, right? So only 8 legislation kind of made the cut, and the cut was being cited in at least 1% of my overall sample. Most of the laws cited here were articles from the Civil Procedure Code and the Civil Code that I've elaborated in the previous slide. Also, the laws 8,245 and 12,112 are tenancy laws. So the law from 2009 actually made it easier for renters to be displaced, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A section. And also we have this law 1060 issued 1960 that determines that free legal assistance must be offered to those that cannot afford legal representation. And finally, this law 8009 issued in 1990 discussed the inseizability right of homestead of properties, right? So this is again is related to lawsuits involving renters, right, tenants and landlords. So I'm not going to have time to explain how, again, how the judiciary works, and I'll explain all the legislations that were mobilized here. But what I wanted to mention, right, to talk about really briefly here are like these 4 points, right, that I like 4 key findings. So the maps and graphs that I share with you today show that although, of course, informal tenants are still at a greater risk of displacement, quantitatively speaking, the incidence of court order removals within the formal housing market cannot be ignored. So renters in particular face a greater threat of eviction. Of course, the numbers are even more alarming when we consider that homeowners represent most residents living in the city. And the second point that I wanted to make is that high value and expensive central neighborhoods in Porto Alegre have the highest eviction rates, even after controlling for population density. And third, that while I observed that while collective eviction litigations involving informal tenants are extensively analyzed in my other chapters, the quantitative analysis that I conducted here showed that for adverse possession laws, the court generally issue eviction verdicts, right? And again, I go more into depth about this in chapter 2. But nonetheless, it's worth mentioning that when looking at possessory actions more broadly, targeting formal and informal tenants, the judges tend to be more conservative when these claims of usurpation of possession are presented. So in these cases, the judges tend to benefit the defendant, right? And lastly, another aspect that stands out is that despite the promulgation of these key legislation, such as the city statute, and the establishment of progressive and inclusive land legislation and concepts such as social function of property, the courts barely cite these laws and these legal concepts, right, in their rulings. Instead, the state judges heavily rely on these bureaucratic articles from civil and civil procedure codes regulating possessory actions. And actually a master's student, actually she got her master in 2018, Clara Boas, also look at informal tenants land struggles in Brazil, specifically in São Paulo, and she also reached similar conclusion that the civil code is the most mobilized legislation when it comes to these land struggles. So once again, Pablo, thank you for inviting me, and I'm welcoming any comments or questions that you might have.
All right, thank you, Fernanda. That's fantastic. Great, so we got a question in the chat already. I was just gonna first congratulate you, Fernanda, on an excellent presentation and an excellent dissertation. I think, you know, this topic is extremely important and very hard to study, as you now know. And I was reflecting on it because so you're focused on the implementation and interpretation of laws by the courts. And I've lately been studying the implementation, interpretation of laws by agencies, by implementing agencies. And so I think that maybe are two research efforts that could talk to one another. But I think it's great that you're doing this work in this growing field. I know there's just a special issue recently about courts and planning. And I think also this case is fantastic because, you know, you have famously progressive on housing and other things, Porto Alegre having these unfair housing practices. But I think, you know, for people interested, I would check out the dissertation itself, because I think your empirical chapters, especially creating and analyzing these new data, is a ton of work and really worth reading about. So I was wondering, you know, I think thinking about the right to housing more generally as also including proactive actions by the government, which I know, you know, happens in Brazil with Minha Casa Minha Vida and other programs. So I guess my understanding is there's this tenancy-related evictions going up in Porto Alegre. The judges aren't using the right to housing or the city statute to protect people's tenancies. But are there other policies happening at the same time to support those people that are being evicted, or is there kind of rent control struggles happening? That's kind of one specific question about this case, whether the judge, I mean, I don't imagine that the judges would know about local rent control or housing programs that they would then say, okay, you're going to get evicted, but, you know, here's this other way you can remain housed. So that's one question. And then my other question, and I'm curious to your thoughts if you have them, about the efforts in the US to advance housing as a right. And I don't think your work suggests that it's not a good idea, but I think I would be interested to hear your thoughts on, in a place like the US, whether, you know, expending advocacy efforts to advance housing as a human right is worthwhile, or should, you know, given that even in a place that has it and it's important and there's a city statute and all these other things, it's still not you know, being used to protect people's housing. So should advocates in the U.S. not focus on that, or what do you think about that question?
I think, Pavel, a very good question. So for the first question in regards to like rent, like legislation and what the judges are actually citing, the legislation that I mentioned, the 1991 and 2009 tenancy laws are basically the only like the key laws when it comes to like regulating these leasing agreements in Brazil. And as I've mentioned, the 2009 law actually like cancels many of the advances that were made by the previous legislation. So again, it became much like easier for judges, right, to issue these eviction mandates within the rental market. But to kind of like add to your question in regards to, especially in regards to like, as you mentioned, like how do we ensure that that poor tenants and other tenants have their right to housing actually enforced, right, by these judges. So one key legislation that I didn't have time to analyze because it was published in 2017, that was published, it's actually called REURB, which is basically like regulating land tiling in Brazil. So many authors claim that this legislation was created to benefit people stealing like land, for example, in the Amazon rainforest and so on, to privatize this land, but it actually ended up benefiting poor tenants living in riverbanks and other unsuitable, so-called unsuitable areas, because it opened like a channel for them to be able to legalize their situation. But again, this is a very new legislation, and we didn't have time to look closely at it, but I'm following some housing activists that basically are saying that this new legislation is becoming a matter of like basically like just negotiating prices for public land. So they're not actually helping the tenants because the government is not required to provide urban infrastructure and so on. It's basically like a piece of paper ensuring that they have like legal like land tiling rights. And in regards to your second question, like in the US, how to advance housing as a human right, is this like useful? So first, I think the only way to advance this is basically by creating tools and mechanisms and ways to ensure that the decommodification of housing. So for example, land trusts in the US are a very like useful like framework to start doing that. And in fact, the Brazil is looking at the US at the moment, right, to be able to incorporate some of these legislation when it comes to these condominiums, right? How can I say, by managing, right, governing these collective, the collective tenure of land. So this is one way, but of course, like it helps to have this encoded right in paper, so the housing becomes their constitutional right. But as we are seeing in the case of Brazil, in paper is one thing, right? Of course, like, okay, housing, like the local governments should provide housing like for all citizens, but a second thing is for these rights to be actually ensured, right, by the state. And I think it's very important for housing activists, for housing movements to keep fighting, right, for these, and to keep fighting for alternatives, again, to decommodify land in any way, including through these community land trusts, as we have here in the US.
Yeah, I mean, and if people are interested in this topic, I think the UN Habitat conferences that happen every 20 years, right? I don't know if you've seen that, Fernanda. Back in the day, we were maybe looking at it in a class. The US, you know, this question of housing as a right comes up every time, and the US delegation always says, "Oh no, we don't support it because it's not well defined," right? And so I think that on the one hand, I don't think the US would support it for a bunch of reasons, but on the other hand, you know, having the definition as part of the law, I think, would be really helpful because it's vague. And then, so, you know, if it's vague, then courts can interpret it in different ways, right?
Yeah, in Brazil is also not well defined, but I think it gives like an opening for housing right movements to claim, like even for example, housing vouchers or any kind of housing assistance. It kind of like it makes like the government they can appeal this in court and make the government like provide any kind of housing assistance, even if it's temporary.
Yeah, that's true. Great. So if people have other questions, please throw them in the chat. But there's one in there about does the constitutional law in Brazil no se cumple en los casos analizados por intereses mercantiles? So it's not. So the question is the law not being applied in the cases you've analyzed because of, financial moneyed interests?
So this is very interesting. Okay, we have again Brazil remains the only country in the world in which the right to the city is encoded in the constitution through this concept that I've mentioned, social function of property. And although the social function of property applies to all urban properties, often they're only being mobilized by judges and by the parties when we are talking about these lawsuits within the informal housing market. So usually in these cases, right, in which we have like more, like how can I say, intereses mercantiles using the civil code and other legislations, we're talking about the formal housing market. And in these cases, the right to the city, the right to housing or social function of property are barely cited.
Interesting. So it's in the informal cases that is brought up, and in the formal market lawsuits, it's not brought up.
Yeah, only in litigations involving informal tenants or informal settlements.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. It seemed to me that civil code was a better way to not get evicted. I mean, I was actually surprised when I first saw this that a third of the cases are decided in favor of the defendant, right? So in a third of the cases, people are not evicted, which was not a bad number. I mean, I think that, one reason that and I wonder if you know why the lawsuits have the lawsuits been increasing over the last 20 years only because evictions in general have been increasing, or are people taking it to court more frequently?
So I think there are two things here. So first, yeah, I think these litigations are increasing because one of the reasons might be related to this new tenancy law, right, that allow landlords to evict like more easily the renters. But on the other hand, I think it also relates to the political like context that we're living in Brazil right now. So the state or the legislative and the executive are becoming very, very conservative. They're trying to actually cancel, right, and review some of the rights already established, right, by these innovative and paradigmatic legislations. So in this sense, I think also the judiciary, although it's again very conservative as well, became kind of one of the only channels where these rights can be pursued and enforced.
Interesting. Cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, check out Fernanda's dissertation. We'll put it in the show notes, and I look forward to seeing the journal articles or the book. The journal articles or book? I guess that's the last question for you.
Thank you so much, Pavel, for inviting me one more time, and I apologize for the missing drafts and for running. But yeah, the dissertation is already published online. You can easily find by typing the title. And if you have any questions or comments, please contact me via email. So it's fernanda.jverri@gmail.com. And thank you also for attending my talk today.
All right.